So let's start with a very quick introduction.
Okay,
So, Jill, you are a fellow naturopathic doctor in this,
I am.
which is, it's so nice that we're not the only ones.
Yes.
But can you tell us a little bit about like how you got into this,
Yeah,
you landed
sure.
here, and what your work looks like now?
Yeah. So I'll give you like the Coles-ish notes. It's always such a long story, right? When it comes to food and bodies. But I'll say that like generally growing up, I had a pretty good relationship with my body. Like I remember, I call it like little moments where diet culture seeped into my childhood for sure. So I was aware of my body. I always say like I was aware that I wasn't like the cultural ideal. I knew that I was considered big boned growing up, and solid was a word that was used a lot. But I was really into soccer, and being solid and strong was really great. And so, um, as a high school kid, well, I knew that like I wasn't like the most beautiful girl in school. I felt pretty confident in my body. I felt confident about my skills and like who I was. And then university hit. I played soccer in university for a bit, and I took a year off and I went away and I lived in England, and I learned about naturopathic medicine. And I had always thought that I would just go into medicine. And I was like, oh my God, this is so fascinating to me. This idea of like working with your body and food. And I was always so into movement, it's like a really big part of my life still. And so I took it home, had a really bad soccer season when I returned to university. The team had shifted a lot, things weren't good. And I just started running on my own. And I would just run the trails in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I lived. And the running coach, it always sounds so creepy, but he's like still a very good friend and we laugh about it. But he would like find me on the trail if he passed me, and he'd just chase me for a little while and be like, you should be a cross country runner. You should join the team. And I'd always be like, no, I'm not a runner. I'm just like working things out. And I went to my first practice and I met my now husband at that first practice. And I didn't know him very well, but I was like, oh, I think I could be a runner, when I met him. And so it all started off like quite positively. But what happened was this combination of like getting interested in food and then switching to running, which is much more a very specific kind of movement versus soccer, which is really like cross training and really values rest and time off and muscle. And, I lost some weight, not even a lot, just some weight. And got so much positive feedback through that I developed a lot of anxiety around my body and weight. So it was sort of like for the first time ever, I was like, well, oh my God, what did I look like before? Like I thought I was kind of fine. But at 19, 20, it just felt very big. And so I just like went further and further down the rabbit hole, specifically with the healthy eating, and developed like what we would now call orthorexia. So I was eating, but not nearly enough for the amount that I was exercising. And it was so restrictive. Like everything was off the list. And then I knew pretty quickly that like this wasn't, I like to eat. I like people. I like being out. Like that's part of my personality. And it made my world very, very, very small. And so I could tell pretty quickly, like, I want out of this. I just didn't know how to get out of it. And I tried like an eating disorder therapist, but I didn't really tick the boxes, which is wild to me because I was so underweight. I went to a medical doctor who was like, sounds like you're just being healthy. Again, no period, wildly underweight. Went to a nutritionist who just tried to make me eat bear paws all the time. And I was like, just wasn't meeting me where I was. So I just had to work myself out of it. And it was really tough because I got into naturopathic school like 2 years later. So I was like working my way out of that, interestingly, while being totally submerged in an educational program that really promotes a lot of the things. And I didn't have the vocabulary. So I just feel like this doesn't feel good to me. Like, I don't know why, but it doesn't feel good to me as I was healing. So the first year I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then by the second year and third year, I was like, I don't know. And then in my fourth year, when we did our residency, women would come in who'd been coming into the clinic for like 5 years for weight loss. And they'd be encouraging me to put her on her 10th diet. And I'd be like, in rounds, I'd be like, guys, I wonder if maybe her body doesn't need to lose weight. And it would be like, like everybody would just stare at me and I'd be like, I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm saying. Okay, sure. We'll put her on the whatever portion counting thing.
It'll work this time.
It'll work this time. Yeah. And I remember questioning that and having one or two really years at school where I was very much like, you don't know what you're talking about, you know? So I kind of set it aside and I left and I started my practice. And I was always, because I had this history, I was very conscious. Like I was never a naturopath who was going to put people on a really strict elimination diet or a candida diet. Like I would never do it. So I would never make anybody else do it, you know? I didn't sell weight loss, you know, but it was embedded in, I see now, it was very much embedded. And like, there were things that I was doing where I was like valuing body changes and specific body shapes and sizes. And like, it was still in there. And so for me, when the rubber really hit the road for me was when my second daughter was born, and my body just like didn't go back.
Yeah.
And so I started to go down that spiral again of like functional testing and like bioidentical hormones and like supplements and like all that stuff has a place. But I was starting to find myself like really wrapped up in this like body stuff. And then I didn't know what to do. So I hired Isabel Fox and Duke, who was brand new on the scene at the time. And I was just like, I don't know what's going on. My body, you know, won't change and I'm not healthy and I'm doing everything right. And blah, blah. And she just was like, I think your body's actually fine. Like we went through the whole thing. I did just a couple sessions with her. And she was like, your eating's fine when you're not getting stressed out about your health. Your movement is fine when you're not. And this is just where your body wants to live. And I was like, oh my God, why has no one ever said this to me before? Why has it never been an option that like, this is just my body now? Like my whole life changed through those two pregnancies and births and babydoms. Like, why wouldn't my body also potentially change, you know? Right. So there was just like kind of like my world exploded because I felt like I had to deal with those last like subtle layers of fat phobia that involve health. And like, so that was 2011, 2012. So by 2013, I was shifting my practice. Like I was like absorbing everything I could, learning everything I could. And then by 2013, I was like really shifting my practice. I was still doing general naturopathic medicine, but I was really focused on like health at every size and intuitive eating. And it was still very new at that time. Like people would be like, oh my God, this is like, I've never heard anybody talk about this before.
Yeah.
And then within a couple of years, I had to totally shut down the general naturopathic side of things. I am revisiting it now through an eating disorder lens, but at the time it felt really tricky. Yeah. Like, so then I closed that down and then I just did this. And then as part of my, like, I was trying to like continue to be trained in this in an ongoing way. I ended up doing training with the Ellen Satter Institute. So, focused on children and adults. And I did like an affiliate and then an associateship. So I did about 2.5 years with her crew. Nice. And it was just great because it's like very research driven, a very specific model that they're teaching, but it is, it's not health. What Ellen always says is the Ellen Satter competency model is not health at every size, but health at every size is the Ellen Satter competency model, if that makes sense. Like it's, am I saying that correctly? It's like health at every size is part of her model, but her model isn't fully health at, I don't know if I'm getting it quite right. I have to like think about that in my brain, but basically they're not the same thing. Yep. But she incorporates health at every size philosophies in her work, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like, you know, people talk about as mindful eating the same as intuitive eating, and mindful eating is part of intuitive eating, but mindful eating is not intuitive.
Right, exactly. So it's very similar, right? Because she's like intuitive eating and her competent eating models are models, and they're like well researched, and there's like data behind the results and the processes. And like, you know, I'm a big proponent of like lived experience and like the art and the science of these models and like using them with the people in front of us and like social determinants of health and stress and circumstance and like all of that. But I do think that there's like validity or value in having a model that we know and understand works, and then we can get creative with it as needed. Right.
Well, it's sort of like when I'm talking to people about creating like a structure around eating, it's a structure that has flexibility. So it holds things together without being brittle and falling apart, and there's
Totally. Yeah.
where, ooh, we got invited out for dinner
Yeah.
or whatever else, right? It's here's the lines. And then as you start to learn them, then you learn how to color outside them without going like,
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I felt like the other reason I was attracted to, because I was sort of deciding, would I get more trained in intuitive eating or would I get trained in the Ellen Satter work? And the one thing that attracted me at that time, which was quite a while ago, was that there was a bit more structure to Ellen's work. And I was finding, I know it's there, it's in intuitive eating, but it wasn't so prominent. And I felt like for specific people with resources and skill sets, the intuitive eating was perfect. Like high skill set, high functioning, lots of support and resources, had way too much structure placed upon them their whole lives. Intuitive eating is perfect because we need to just shrug off all the structure. But then there was this like whole other group of people where it was like neurodiversity, where they just couldn't connect with their body, or children, or people who just didn't have the same like support systems in place. Like I'm working with people with like diabetes or with who just didn't have the same backgrounds or experiences or support networks. It was like structure went a really long way, or more disordered eating, right? Like you can't just throw someone with really disordered eating into something with no structure. Yeah. And so this was like, it provided me with clear structure that I could use within which people would learn to be autonomous and like do their thing. Yeah.
I love it.
It's really cool.
Yeah. And so as I said, while we were preambling before we started recording, the main motivator for this particular interview was to talk about that with kids. Cause that is, I went the intuitive eating route and did that training. And I fully agree with you. I mean, very often I'm like, look, you're not ready to listen for your hunger.
For yourself. Yeah.
Listen for it, but it's not there enough yet. And so there needs to be like a commitment to eat,
Right.
Again, structure, not what you eat, not how much you eat, but like you're going to need to eat it regularly.
Just regularity. We're like trying to get your body back on track. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And so then very often, so when I'm working with usually the mom on her stuff, then some of the questions come up for the kids. But the more challenging ones that I have questions about is when the parents are still very much in that, let's throw them into orthorexia, because a lot of people land in that space right now.
This is like predominantly who I work with when it comes to kids. Yeah.
Incredibly fearful of food and allowing their children to experience all of the foods. And so, but then they start to see that their child is developing an eating disorder or developing something that is scary. And so then they come and they go, well, how do we do what? I just let them eat whatever they want, whenever they want. So how do we address that? How do we assure parents that their child can develop a healthy relationship with food without it being what they believe is the opposite of that, which is eat all the things, never eat anything nutritious or nutrient dense ever again in their life?
Right. So for me, oh my God, it's like such a big question. I always feel like I'm having this like brain explosion because I want to tackle it from so many angles. So let's just play with it. And then hopefully we like land the plane by the time this is all done, because there's a lot to this. Yep. But I would say like the first thing you identified first and foremost is like so much of the work is building the parents' eating competence. And so what I mostly do is in like the first session, I do like a full assessment of the child, parent, household, how they're eating, how they're feeding, development, like things that might be getting in the way of the child's ability to like regulate themselves, like neurodiversity. Like there definitely are things that could interfere with the child's ability. Full assessment. And then I lay out the division of responsibility, and we'll talk about that. Like, let's get clear on it. But I just lay out the division of responsibility and I'm like, off you go for 2 weeks. And then from that point on, it is legitimately like, it's like whack-a-mole of like objections.
Yeah.
Which I love. Like, I love it, but it's like, I'm just waiting. Like they're going to come back with like the 10 reasons why this can't work or whatever. And so much of it with the parents that I work with, the majority of it is orthorexic tendencies. So like really unrealistic expectations for what children should be eating, that many children, specifically the ones that I end up seeing, because there are kids who are just generally by genetic and nature like more flexible with food, right? Those kids like with the more easygoing personalities that are less sensitive to life in general, they can kind of like sometimes just deal with whatever the parents are throwing at them. But then there are these other children, right? And the way that we, sensitive maybe, but like specifically sensitive to pressure. And when they sense pressure to do something that they're not ready for, or that feels scary to them, or that doesn't feel right to them, or that they don't like, they aren't so easygoing about it. And so they tend to shut down, where they become incredibly picky and basically refuse to eat, or they become very reactive and rebellious, where the parents are finding them with like the nanny's loaf of bread behind a kitchen door because they're not allowed carbohydrate, right?
Yep.
And so it's this like interesting dance of like building the parents' eating competence, challenging their beliefs about healthy eating for themselves, challenging their understanding of like how children grow to become healthy eaters, and then like helping them to allow their children to find regulation for themselves, which is it's difficult. Like it's when kids have been taken down that route. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Some kids adjust really quickly. Like sometimes after 2 weeks, they're like, oh my gosh, this like, there's one little girl I'm thinking of in particular who every car ride home from school, every day during dinner, all she talked about like was pizza and ice cream. Like all she talked about is like, when is the next birthday coming? When do I get to go to the next birthday party? And she was the one that was like sneaking bread and all these things. And within a couple of weeks, they're like, oh my God, this like fixation on pizza has totally stopped. And I'm like, right, because she's like allowed to eat pizza,
For the birthday party.
Yeah. And it took months before she like fully was regulating herself in a way that felt like normal to the parents. But the mental fixation stopped very quickly, and then she found it. So I don't know if I answered that question, but it's essentially putting the division of responsibility in place. And like, depending on the situation, sometimes I'm really hardcore about it. Other times I'm like, okay, we just have to like, what's the balance here? How can we do the best with division of responsibility that we possibly can, especially through COVID? Because, as we talk about division of responsibility, the one thing that does come up is how much parent involvement there is. And it's interesting because obviously when parents are being, overbearing and hyper controlling on food, there's involvement, but it's a different kind of involvement, right? You have to put energy into a really different place. And through COVID, it was just incredibly hard. Like parents are trying to work and kids are home and 3 kids have different snack schedules and lunch schedules. And like, so I got creative through COVID. But the good news is that like, as long as there's a little bit of that division of responsibility in place, things tend to improve and get better.
Let's take a second now to just define what that division of responsibility is. Yeah.
Sure. So the division of responsibility is that structure that you were talking about. And the analogy that I use for anyone who ever read any of like Barbara Colaroso's book, she's like a parenting specialist. Yeah. I like totally loved her when my kids were little. And she talks about creating backbone parents, right? Where there's this like strong spine, but it's like very flexible and very movable, And she talks about like jellyfish parents where there's like no structure, no boundaries, and then brick wall parents where it's like all structure, all rules, no flexibility. And that like when it comes to eating, many of us like she doesn't talk about eating, I relate it to eating, but like many of us, we either grew up in brick wall households, so we're jellyfish with our kids, or we grew up in jellyfish households, so we're brick walls with our kids. And it's like, how can we come back and find this place in the middle where you are confident in where to set boundaries and also where to let go? Because that is the part that's confusing for people, because it's like they want to take control of the food choices and the amount and and if they're not doing that, then they think they can't say no to anything ever. So the division of responsibility is essentially outlines the role of the parent in feeding and eating and the role of the child. And as Ellen would say, there's like a double yellow line in the middle of that, and
No,
there's no crossing. And, the things that tend to interfere with children's eating patterns is over interference and under interference. So both of those things. So the parent like crossing the line and doing the kids' jobs, or the parent not taking on their roles that they're supposed to take on. So both of those things. So like that would be like a parent micromanaging every single food a kid eats, including at school and at birthday parties and everywhere. Or it could be like just having the TV on and letting kids serve themselves and make all their decisions all the time. So the division of responsibility, essentially that parents are responsible for the what, the when, and the where of feeding. And I think that this is important because parents are always in charge of the foods they bring into their home. Right. Always. Now, we do some education around easing up if they have orthorexic tendencies. Like, you got to ease up. We need to work on this. Like, kids need access to lots of different kinds of food, but there's still some there's still room for parents to infuse their values and preferences and ideals into eating, because they're responsible for the what, the shopping, the prep, the ordering in, the freezer meals, the whatever they decide to serve. They're in charge of that. The where, which is ideally at a dinner table as often as possible. And the when. And the when is making sure that children are reliably fed every few hours, like every 2 to 3 hours on a, fairly predictable schedule.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And so children are responsible for the if and how much. So when food is put in front of them, they are fully in charge of if they decide they want to eat and how much. A couple of caveats or a couple of add-ons, I guess, would be that we're trying to serve meals and snacks as often as possible. Family style is what Ellen calls it. And so family style is essentially where you just put as much of the food on the table, buffet style sort of, as possible, and children get to choose the if and how much.
Right. So they get to decide if they're going to put any rice on their plate and how much. And same with the carrots or the beans or the
right.
whatever. Yeah, it's
there.
So
I always say like a roast chicken dinner or a roast beef dinner is like a perfect family meal, because it's like there's roast beef and then there's like green beans and then there's mashed potatoes and then there's gravy and there's peas and there's, some buns or something, but you can also do that. Like tacos are great. And even a stir fry, you could do like the vegetables and the meat and the rice and the, whatever, or even soup, like even with really young kids, we'll put the vat of soup and we'll help, but soup and bread and a plate of chopped up vegetables or whatever. But the idea is we're presenting children with the way we like to eat as parents. And that we know that when we allow them to explore and choose and regulate, that by the time they are teenagers and young adults, teens is probably a little early, young adults, they will eat the way that their parents eat.
Interesting.
But that doesn't happen by 3 or 8 or 12, right? Like, but I try to remind parents, like, you're obsessed with health and your parents fed you like, whatever you thought was the grossest food in the world in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't eat a tomato properly till I was like in my 20s. I didn't like olives until I was 25. I didn't like beets until I was 26, or no, earlier than that, 24 probably. Like, there are so many foods that my parents ate regularly that I loathed as a child, and I eat all of them now, right? And I was allowed, probably a little too far on the under interference with my parents, but like, it was through the allowance of food,
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was the other thing I was going to mention? Oh, and then we have to do a lot of talk around the judicious use of what Ellen calls forbidden foods. So like whatever the forbidden foods are in a household, like how do we use them and how do we incorporate them? and how often do we incorporate them? And it really has a lot to do with the child. Like, what are they fixated on? How fixated are they? But it's very much like the make peace with food process and intuitive eating, where if they're hyper fixated, like on the pizza, I'd be like, okay, you're going to serve this as dinner or as part of dinner or a side of dinner or lunch that goes to school or a snack, like many times a week, until this kid is like feels safe that this food is not a restricted food. And like the scientific term for that is like sensory specific. Oh my God, I'm having like a perimenopausal brain fart. Say like it's like sensory specific, like basically boredom. That's not the right word, but it's essentially like when you give them something that tastes the same, eventually all human beings like get tired of it.
In intuitive eating, they talk about the habituation studies,
Mm-hmm.
where it's and actually they use pizza and college students as one of the examples, where they say,
right,
you know, come be part of the study. You get pizza for dinner every night for the next month. And, you know, broke college students are like, yeah. And yeah, by the end of the first week, they're like, I mean, could we different pizza? Could we have salad with the pizza? Could we? Nope, just pizza. It doesn't take very long before they're like, okay, it's
right. And the only thing that interferes with that very natural habituation process is the fear of scarcity.
Yes.
The psychological threat of scarcity is the only thing that interferes with that process. So the work is, how do we provide this food for children and reduce the perceived pressure that they feel to not eat it, or to not, you know, that it's going to be taken away. And then people will say things like, so what do? You just like, you know, you just like give them pizza all day, every day. And it's like, no, we rely, like you are setting the structure. So what, when, where. You're feeding them, you know, let's say 6 times a day, and maybe, you know, at least once a day, every day of the week for 2 or 3 weeks, pizza is offered up, or maybe 5 times a week, pizza is offered up, or 3 times. Like,
yeah,
I'll work with people,
yeah,
but we got to get it in there.
Yeah.
We got to get it in there, and it needs to be reliable enough that we start to settle down this fear. And the structure is that children, Ellen's quite like merciless about it. I would say I'm a little bit more of a zhuzhy mom in terms of like, she's like nothing in between meals and snacks. Like, it is only water. And I will say, for like incredibly picky kids, like when there's real resistance to eating, I will push that quite hard, right? Like, I'll be like, no, some of this is behavior. Like if I get the sense that a lot of it is behavioral, I'll push the model quite hard. But I always say to parents, like, if you have a real sense, like I've got 2 super active kids, if they come home from dance and they're really hungry, like anytime you feel like your child is actually just very hungry, you can always offer up a piece of fruit, like a piece of bread with some peanut butter. Like, we're not trying to starve anybody out, but we are trying to teach children, like, who, if they have, for example, been in a household where it's just like, eat whatever you want, cry and throw a fit, and then I'll give you the yogurt that you like. Like, we do have to interrupt that pattern in order to like get them back on track. And that has happened, right? Like, so if kids have felt pressure and then they've frozen up, then the parents start attending to that freezing because they're terrified the kid's not eating. And so we have to interrupt that pattern. And we do that by like, here's what you're getting for breakfast. Say it's cereals or yogurt and fruit and granola. It's all on the table. You get to choose if and how much. And if you refuse to eat this, there's nothing until snack at 10:30 a.m. You know, if that's 8, right? The one other little caveat, which is kind of like sneaky but not, is that one of the rules is that you try to make sure that there is always a safe food on the table for kids, because the safe food will allow them to say yes to something and to choose something.
Right.
As they sneak up on the other foods, like as they like, so if, say you're going to serve a stir fry, might be a good example. So say it's a lot for your kid, right? The vegetables mixed with meat or chickpeas or tofu or whatever mixed with sauce and rice, like that can be a lot for a kid. Yeah. People are like, what? That doesn't make sense. It's a lot. It's a lot for some. It's a lot of texture. It's a lot of taste. It's a lot of stuff. So it's like, maybe you separate out the protein and the vegetables and sauce and the rice. And maybe for the first few meals, they just eat rice. again, they're not going to starve to death because they can have a bedtime snack at 7 o'clock before they go to bed or whatever. They can have a yogurt and a piece of fruit or whatever you guys decide to serve. But like when you put it out on the table without pressure, especially if kids have felt a lot of pressure, they'll often just choose rice for the first little while, you know, but then that habituation kicks in, children's natural curiosity kicks in, and they're like, huh, maybe I will take one piece of pepper. And they just put it on their plate and that's all they do. And then they like eat it a little bit of it the next time. And then they spit it out and they're like, bleh, you know, and parents think of all of these things as fails. And the big job is to see it as success, is to understand that like sitting at the table with food they don't like and not freaking out. Success. For a lot of families, that's a huge first step. Second, being interested in what's on other people's plates and what they're eating, you modeling genuinely enjoying those foods. It's a win. Them playing with it, eating it, spitting it out. This is all what Ellen describes as how kids sneak up on food. This is how they learn to eat.
Right. Yeah.
And the study, yeah.
Flavors. Yeah.
And the studies are really clear. Like there are some pressure-based techniques to get kids to eat. And this is also true in like, the studies are also quite consistent and clear, even in like autism spectrum disorder. Like a lot of the models for getting kids to eat are very pressure filled. And like what they have shown is like with autism specifically, like kids understand, these are not dumb kids. These are incredibly bright children who are like, they understand the context. And so they play the game when the game is being played. And then the moment that it's off, like when the context changes, they just go back to like, I refuse to eat that.
Right.
And so this is what's happening with all children really, is that we can pressure them, but the minute that pressure is gone, they go in whatever direction they're going to go. And often when the pressure is big, it's like not a very good direction. And so in alleviating the pressure, what we're trying to do is allow them to progress at their own rate. And when they arrive to liking a food, they genuinely like it and they like it for life, and they regulate themselves really well around nutritiously like dense foods and foods that are slightly less dense nutrition. They regulate themselves equally well around all of those foods.
Beautiful.
That's the goal. There's one other thing I wanted to say. I can't remember. I think like, it's just like, there's like a roasted sweet potato example in our family where like my kids ate roasted sweet potatoes when they were really little. And then they hit that age, you know, like 3, 4, where they started being like, sweet potatoes are disgusting. And so, you know, we would regularly serve up like a salad and chicken and like a bowl full of roasted sweet potatoes. And then I would always put like some warm bread or something on the table. And the kids would like eat the chicken and the bread. And then sometimes they eat some of the salad and sometimes not. And then they would, you know, the sweet potatoes are disgusting, disgusting, disgusting. And then after like several years of this, like 3 years of this, more than that probably for the older one, there was like a pan of sweet potatoes that were roasted on the oven. And as I was like serving everything up, she grabbed one and ate it. And she was like, that's delicious. It was like salt and cinnamon and like, I don't know what else was on them, but they were really good. And those 2 kids devoured that entire pan of sweet potatoes, and like, they love sweet potatoes now. They choose salad freely of their own. Every now and then they'll have a meal that's just chicken and bread, but very rarely. And they're kids who genuinely like, I haven't had to tell them to eat salad. I haven't had to tell them to like sweet potatoes. Same with avocados, same with like lots of these foods that they ate as babies and then like shunned. At 13 and 11, they're already coming back to those foods. Do they like sugary food? Yeah, they do. They do like sugary foods because sugary foods are delicious. But for the most part, they regulate themselves quite well. Sometimes they eat all the cookies on the plate. Other times, 4 bites into a piece of ice cream cake, they're like, could you just put this away from me? I don't want it anymore. I'll have it later. And then they forget about it and we throw it out 2 weeks later. Like there's this like natural ebb. And if a food is really novel and they only get it at Christmas, they like gobble it up the way that adults do. But they also can regulate themselves. And like, it's just, you know, I see it in my practice, but it's also really fun to see it play out with your own kids and to see this like natural ability to like leave things on their plate or to say yes to things like Indian food and like olives and like really big tastes, to see them just say yes to those things voluntarily, not because they're being pressured to do it. Yeah. Did I cover it all? That was a lot. I mean, that was like,
no, it was amazing. And my head is exploding with questions.
mhm.
I'm trying to remember actual questions from patients who have, because I've introduced the concept of division of responsibility, but clearly don't understand it to the same degree that you do.
Mhm.
And some of the questions are, well, how often are they allowed to have dessert? Or how often
Mhm.
are they allowed to have like the chips as the snack and that kind of stuff when they're feeling like they shouldn't be except for special occasions? Like,
Right. So that's, yeah. So I always start with the parents, like, well, how often would you eat dessert? Because quite often parents are like sneaking dessert later at night when the kids are in bed. So the
right.
kids aren't getting any sugar, but even the parents who are health conscious are like, well, I have a little chocolate in the evening when the kids are in bed, or like have a little, so we really, I asked the parents first, how often would you have dessert? And so if it's like, well, actually like 5 nights a week, probably we have something sugary. I'm like, perfect. You're just going to do it at dinner.
Right.
You're not going to hide it or whatever. So if they say none, then again, it's like, okay, well, that's not actually like, kids can't learn how to be competent with something that they have zero exposure to. And this isn't drugs, you know what I mean? It's like food, and they're going to be exposed to it at school, at friends' houses, at birthday parties. Like, this is not something, it's real. It exists. You know what I mean? Like, how do we make it so that they're not binge eating it to the point of feeling sick every birthday party that they go to?
Yeah.
How we do that is through exposure. And so what we do is, snack times tend to be really good times for like full, like, I'll be like, after school 2 days a week, I want you to like put out a huge plate of cookies, like more than you could ever imagine. Like, I don't know, like say you got like a box from Loblaws or something. It's just like pile a bunch of them on a plate. And if you want to, chop up some apples, like, make it a snack that you feel good about. Sit down and just let them eat. Just let them regulate themselves. And they'll overdo it sometimes and they'll underdo it sometimes. And like, it's all, especially at the beginning, they'll probably overdo it if they haven't been allowed. It's fine. Do that. Like, if they're not allowing it at all, I'll be like, do it like 3 times a week after school, or like on the weekend, movie night, just big bowls. Everything feels plentiful. So there's not like, if you give them like one cookie, there's still that feeling of like, oh, I got to get it all in. And then if there's another cookie, I got to get it all in. And then if there's another cookie, got to get it all in, because it's like, they don't know when it's going to end. The scarcity is there. But if there's a big platter of cookies, there's this feeling of abundance and allowance, and like, I'm choosing what I'm going to allow in.
And they know it's not going to be another week or month or 6 months before they get the
right. So I'll usually say something like 3 times a week, do something like that to start. Sometimes more often if the preoccupation is really intense, like even for just a week or two, and then you can reduce, but around that amount. Dessert is with dinner is the one time that Ellen suggests we like break the if and how much rule. And that's just because dinner is such an important meal of the day. And if kids know that they can have as much dessert as they want, they will, like, sugar is appealing, like it just is. So what we suggest, especially with kids who are obsessed with dessert, is everybody gets 1 serving of dessert with dinner. That's it. And it just goes on the table with dinner, which sounds weird.
But they can eat it
whenever. They can eat at the beginning, but there's only 1 serving. So like, they're probably not going to be full. And even if they think they're done the first few times, there's nothing until they have snack, and then there's nothing until bed. So they learn pretty quickly, like, oh, I have to eat dinner.
Gotcha.
As well. So like, a really good example, my sister has toddlers right now, and a bunch of her friends have done this recently, and they've been talking a lot about it, because around 3, kids start to be quite obsessed. They know dessert exists. They talk about dessert all the time. They want dessert. And if dessert is being offered, my sister's like, Teddy, her little guy, would like eat 3 bites and then be like, I'm done. I'm ready for dessert. I'm ready for dessert. And she's like, Teddy, like, dessert is coming, dude. Like, just eat your dinner, and then we're going to have, I'm done. And it's like, it started this whole spiral, and a bunch of her friends were going through this too. So she's like, okay, finally, I'm going to just like listen to Jill and like try this whole thing. And she just started putting dessert on the table. And yeah, the first night, Teddy ate up the whole brownie or whatever it was, and like maybe a little bit of dinner. Carla's like, by the end of the first week, he was like a few bites of the brownie, a few bites of dinner, a few bites of the brownie, a few bites of dinner. It's like half the time now he leaves half the dessert. He doesn't even finish it. Like it just diffuses the energy around dessert by just putting it out, you know? And don't get me wrong, when that energy settles down, I think it's totally fine. Like, I think part of eating is also teaching children how we eat. And so, like, I don't serve dessert on the dinner table every night, but my kids have a really unpressurized relationship with food. So we just eat it after now. Like, the trust is there, it's built. But for kids where the trust is not there and it is not built, this is a really, really good way to do it. So snacks are a good time for like really giving them full autonomy with forbidden foods. And dinner is also a good time, but we only do one serving because it encourages them to learn how to like
Consume
eat dinner with the family.
the dinner.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So then my brain is then going to, I mean, most of the women, and pardon for the men.
Yeah.
They're
No,
not.
I get it. I get it.
The women that I work with who are struggling with their own relationship with food, and they are trying to claw back a bit on the rules for their own selves. How do they navigate that nuance of this is what there is to eat, and what if you're like, I don't feel like eating that right now? Like an intuitive eating, we'd be like, well, then don't eat that, have something else. But it sounds like this kind of structure.
Well, I
might
like
not
to think that
necessarily
kids have a little, I like to think that kids have some like fewer layers on them
for
of, and I think like the way that we kind of get around that is by trying to make sure that there's like a safe food on the table for
Right.
kids, right? Because there should always be ideally something on the table that you know your kid likes and happily eats. And if you do that, then they always have choice. They could just eat bread, and kids will do that, you know?
Oh
And
yeah,
then parents get
sure.
very upset about it. But again, if we just let it go long enough, it's not that exciting or interesting to only eat bread, you know? Like
Right.
even children with like Deb, one of the women that I went through the affiliate and associateship with, really just works with like autism spectrum disorder. And like the first thing I think that's really important is like even children with autism spectrum disorder find flexibility when they go through it's very slow, but they find it as they go through this process. But she's run their diets through programs many times, you know, and she's like, even highly restricted kids tend to be doing a fairly good job of getting their base nutrient requirements in. And like in the very healthist world we currently live, where there's a lot of toxic wellness messaging, and I remember this, and I remember buying into it as a student. Why would we shoot for just meeting the minimum requirements when we could be getting the ideal amount, when we could be 5xing the amount of vitamin C they get in? Why wouldn't we? If we're going to ruin their relationship with food, that's why we wouldn't. That's why we wouldn't. You know, like
Yeah.
meeting base requirements is more than enough. If feeding is turning into a battle with children, if it is turning to an eating disorder, if it is turning into like chaotic family meals, people yelling and crying and kids in bedrooms, that is why we don't need to 5x the vitamin C in their diet. You know, like
Not a fair trade-off.
like I know that there is huge disparity in like access to food across the world, but like most of the people that I work with, their kids are in the upper echelon of access to food. All the extras, the kale, the quinoa, the acai, the green smoothie, these are icing on top of all what we absolutely need, which is like a very basic cake. You know what I mean? Like they're icing and they're cherries and they're sprinkles. And like, if you happen to have a kid that loves eating those foods, amazing. But trying to force a child,
Right.
and not allowing them to just sit where they need to sit for as long as they need to with that like fundamental basics of nutrition, which really do meet most of their needs. And in the messy process, because that will come up, you know, sometimes I do a multivitamin or something with kids because, you know, we have to go through a bit of mess to repair this relationship with food. That's what supplements are for. They're there to supplement. The one other thing I think comes up is kids decide if and how much. And then parents will say, one other thing that comes up with me a lot is like with the sweet potatoes, like now that the kids love sweet potatoes and sweet potato fries, like they often actually fight over them. And like sweet potato fries in general, like if you go and you actually buy them frozen and cook them, they're like expensive and then they come in small amounts, you know, and parents will say, well, what if one kid just wants to take all of them? Because that's, and then brother and sister are like, well, what about us?
Yeah.
So it's this interesting dance of, one of the things I try to do if that comes up is I try to, especially in the healing process, I'll buy 3 bags and cook them and put them out, like more than I think will get eaten. It's a bit expensive, but if there's leftovers, we just eat them for lunches and dinners the next day. But like, I try to buy more than enough to try to settle that behavior down. But then there's also parenting behaviors where you could be like, part of this is also being aware of your other family members at the table. So like, we're going to divide up our first servings fairly equally if everybody loves this thing. I understand you love it. I understand you want more of it. I'll try the next time I go grocery shopping to make sure that I have more. So you're like, but just objectively being like, this is just rude behavior is really different from pressuring a child to not eat so much. And there are studies that show it's like in the intuitive eating book as well, like kids can discern the difference between the pressure around their body and health from just like a firm no. Like,
right. Yes. There are 3 brownies.
Like kids with allergies, right?
Each have 1.
Like kids who have allergies have firm no's, but the energy behind those no's is quite different. And it doesn't mean it's not a challenge, because it is a challenge. But those kids don't tend to grow up to binge eat those foods, because it's objective and it's clear why there's a no and what the no is there for. When it's all around wibbly, like worries about health and weight and like whatever, it's just the energy is a lot more wibbly. I don't know, there's like not a more scientific word for it that I have right now. And it's a lot more pressure filled versus like, this is just an unfortunate fact, and I'm going to emotionally support you through this really tricky thing that kind of sucks,
more like abstract future health concerns as opposed to concrete natural consequences.
Right. Like, this is very dangerous for you. We have to be very cautious and like, there's clarity. Yes. And when it's a bit of a generalization, but when there's clarity, children seem to be able to manage those boundaries very well. But when it just feels like this constant pressure to not like what they like and not enjoy what they enjoy and not satisfy themselves, and that is where things start to go kind of awry.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So then this process you use with some adults as well.
Yep, definitely. I mean, the division of responsibility, obviously, it isn't really in play when it's an adult, but it's like that same kind of like feeding yourself regularly and reliably every couple of hours, choosing whatever it is you want to eat, and like trying to enjoy what you have chosen. Like, choose food you enjoy the food you choose. And then, just the same as you, the whack-a-mole of all the objections as to why that might be a good idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is lots, because we've all been taught all kinds of silly food rules and body rules and health rules that interfere with our ability to feed ourselves. And like, this is again what we're trying to like.
Yeah.
What's so interesting is like, we had a lot of diet rules applied to us, but now kids have diet rules and health rules applied to them.
It's interesting working with someone who is younger than us, and sort of in that she doesn't have kids yet, but she's definitely adult. Anyways, she doesn't identify with the term diet culture. Wellness is what she has been.
It's wellness culture.
100%. Even though same deal with lots of food rules, lots of restrictions, and end goal to shrink your body. Like, it's okay.
Oh, it's in there. It's very subtle, but it's always in there.
And shrink your body.
And just to slim down just a little. Just a little.
Trim things up a little bit, get rid of some toxins.
Just to get into my healthy weight. Just to get to my healthy weight.
Right. So it's really interesting working with.
I don't know how old you are. I'm 43. And even I would say, like, there was like, I knew enough by the time we were in like the late 90s, like early 2000s, that it was kind of laughable, like those like grapefruit diets and the cabbage soup diet of the 80s. And like, we would kind of like laugh and make fun of that, not realizing we were doing the exact same thing to ourselves with like incredibly strict long-term elimination diets that we didn't necessarily need. And like, like, it's like we were sort of, it was like almost it was like a little gauche to be a dieter in my mind.
Mhm.
But I had just adopted this whole new religion of wellness that was like all the same principles.
Just repackage. Yeah,
Just
I'm
and
45.
just more morality associated with it, right? Like in the 80s, I would argue like there was something almost a little bit more free about just being able to like eat your jelly bellies because they were like, you could just make whatever food choices you wanted. And there wasn't like, you felt bad if you ate too much of something, but now it's like you feel bad if you ate too much and it's not the right quality, it's not the right combination, it's not the right that it's like there's like 10 extra layers. It's not just how
And
much anymore.
ordinary food that comes out of the ground causes stress, like
Bananas, carrots,
banana.
potatoes.
A patient saying, "You mean I can eat a whole banana now?" Like, yep. But like, if a whole banana is what's going to satisfy you in that moment, then yes, please eat the whole banana.
Yeah,
Like,
I have this long term, I have like a document on my computer about writing a book called Bananas. And it's like
I love
like, cause like how nuts we all feel. And like,
this.
also like, why are we scared of it? At what same, like I think that was actually interestingly, like when I decided that I really had to shut my naturopathic practice was in the course of like a week. I talked like 3 different patients down. One was like counting olives. One was terrified of putting a banana in her smoothie. And the other was scared of eating carrots. And
Yeah,
because of the carb content. And I was like, what is happening? I was like, I just can't participate in this anymore. And again, I think like we're both finding our way back to being
I
naturopaths
had
who
that
don't
same crisis
participate.
too.
But at the time I was
won't
like,
be
I can't
part
do
of
this.
this. Yeah. And then it's like, no, they need us. Like,
Yeah, they
we
need
need
us.
to be in this
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's terrifying, some of the, and they're like just spoken as though it's true. The
Mhm.
critical thinking seems to be lost in some of this of,
Yeah, agree.
let's just slow this down and really like just
Mhm.
breathe. But anyways,
Yeah, so there's so much more to this. Ellen Satter's website and her books are like a treasure trove of like detail and information. And then if anybody has any questions,
mhm.
about their own
Yeah,
children, I do
we'll put
consults all the time.
all your links and stuff,
Okay.
so that people know how to get hold of you. And thank you. Yeah,
You're
I
so
feel like
welcome.
we
Thanks
could
for
talk
having me.
6 hours about all
Oh,
of
I know.
this.
I know.
But this gives people a nice little introduction to some practical tools that they can start to apply. And if it's absolutely terrifying, they can talk to you about
They
it.
can call me. That's
I
right.
love it.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill.
So good to see you.
We'll see you again soon.